Good morning, everyone, and thank you so much for joining us online today. My name's Nick, and I'm the Networks and Engagement Manager at NCVO, and I'll be facilitating today's webinar with content delivered by our trusted supplier, Zurich Insurance. So over the course of the next hour, we'll be focused on developing and embedding risk assessments for volunteers, where we'll cover how to create a risk assessment, the roles and responsibilities, key considerations for volunteers, and the importance of ongoing monitoring and reporting. Now, expertly guiding us through the next hour will be Dawn Kluwer, a liability risk consultant from Zurich Resilience Solutions. But before I hand over to her, there's just a couple of housekeeping points that I wanted to note. So hopefully you'll have seen that closed captions have been enabled, and you can turn these on or off by clicking on the CC icon in the toolbar at the bottom of your screen. In just a moment, my colleague Chanel will share a slide deck for today in the chat. So if it would help with accessibility, you can download these slides to your computer to zoom in and out of them as we go along. The slides will also be shared in a follow-up email shortly after today's webinar. So today's webinar is just an hour, so we'll be running straight through without a break, but we will have time to take questions in the final 15 minutes. So any questions that you have, please submit them to us via the Q&A function at the bottom of the screen. Please bear in mind that we can only really facilitate questions related to the risk assessments and the topics that we're exploring today. And please don't add questions to the chat, as they are likely to get lost. With the chat, if there's a lot going on there and it becomes a bit distracting, you can click on the chat icon at the bottom of the screen, which will close the chat window and can take that away from your attention. And then finally, you may have noticed that today's webinar is being recorded, but everyone has joined in view-only mode, which means the only people that you'll be able to see and hear will be Dawn and I, plus my colleague Chanel, who is producing today's webinar. The recording will be uploaded to the NCVO YouTube channel within the next week, and we'll share a link with that to you as well. So as we've only got an hour together today, let's get stuck into the content. And to lead us through the webinar on developing and embedding risk assessments for volunteers, I'm pleased to hand over to our expert from Zurich, Dawn Kluwer.
Good morning, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar on developing and embedding effective risk assessments for volunteers. We're thrilled to have you join us, and we'll delve into a topic that's vital for the safety and success of your organisation and volunteer programmes. It can be quite a daunting process, and hopefully we're going to talk you through with some straightforward and simple tips. Ensuring volunteer safety requires being proactive in identifying and managing risks. In this session, we will explore how to develop and embed effective risk assessments for your volunteers. We will discuss how to, best practices, and share some examples that you can implement in your own programmes. The goal is to empower you with the knowledge and tools necessary to foster a safe and supportive environment for the invaluable work of your volunteers. So, what are we going to talk about? We'll be covering in this session what is a risk assessment for volunteers, the law and how it applies, your organisation and volunteer responsibilities, how to create a risk assessment for volunteers, key considerations, ongoing monitoring and reporting, some simple practical tips, and have a Q&A session at the end. So, let's talk about some myths and misunderstandings to do with risk assessments. Who believes that the risk assessment statements shown on the slide are true? Well, I can tell you that they're not. However, many people do believe that health and safety regulations can be overly complicated or unnecessary. This can lead to complacency when it comes to risk management and risk assessments. Others think that safety measures are only relevant for large organisations or specific high-risk activities, overlooking the fact that every volunteer role carries its own unique risks. By debunking these myths, we can foster a culture of safety that empowers organisations like yours to prioritise the health and safety of volunteers and staff, and ultimately enhancing the effectiveness and sustainability of your volunteer programmes. Just going back to quickly the risk assessments being long and complex, absolutely not necessary. They need to be clear, concise and understandable. And when we're talking about reducing risk to zero, no, I mean, we can have risk coming from getting out the car, driving, crossing the road. It's about putting safety measures in place. So when we're looking at the law and why, Why is it important to complete risk assessments? There's three key reasons. The law and compliance. So employers must ensure that the health and safety of employees and others affected by their work activities, as required by sections 2 and 3 of the Health and Safety at Work regulations, and regulation 3 of the Management of Health and Safety at Work regulations. Legal expectations. Risk assessments have been a legal requirement in the UK for over 25 years, setting a minimum standard for workplace safety. The consequences of failing to meet legal standards can lead to more accidents, fines, imprisonment, civil claims. Nowadays, obviously, there's a moral reason and safety expectation. Everyone expects to go or to do any work in a safe environment and go home unharmed. And societal change, modern workplaces and societal norms demand higher health and safety and environmental standards compared to the past. Also, there's financial reasons. Risk assessments help identify risks and implement practical control measures to prevent harm. The cost of accidents is expensive. Accidents can be costly due to injury, ill health, damage, compensation, investigation time, and reputational damage. And also it's the uninsured costs. They can be up to 10 times greater than the insured costs and include fines, temporary labour, interruption to your organisation. It can be hard to quantify, but in summary, by completing risk assessments, it's crucial for legal compliance, moral responsibility and financial efficiency of your organisation. You should provide the same level of protection to volunteers as you would any employee. It's no different. So when does health and safety law not apply? In most cases, health and safety law does not apply where volunteering does not involve an employer. However, there are some exceptions, such as where a volunteer is in control of a non-domestic premises, such as a village or community hall, procures or controls construction work. For example, if a village hall management committee employs a builder to carry out renovation work. So when civil law applies, if you have volunteers carrying out activities for your organisation and you have no employees, then health and safety law would not normally apply to you. However, you do still have duties under civil law. Under the common law, voluntary organisations and individual volunteers have a duty of care to each other and others who may be affected by their activities. So when something goes wrong, individuals may in some cases sue for damages using the civil law if they are injured as a result of another person's negligence. So when it comes to carrying out risk assessments, it's really important and essential to understand the various roles and responsibilities involved in the process. Each individual plays a critical part in ensuring the safety of volunteers and the effectiveness of any programmes. Key roles would typically include management and leadership of an organisation. So the people at the top of the organisation have the responsibility to foster a culture of safety within any organisation. They set the tone for the importance of risk assessments, allocate any necessary resources, and ensure that risk management is in place and communicated effectively. Where there are managers or supervisors in charge, this role is often designated to individuals who may lead the risk assessment process. They're often responsible for planning and coordinating the assessments, gathering input from various stakeholders, and ensuring that assessments are conducted thoroughly and systematically. In some organisations, there might be designated safety officers or health and safety reps who specialise in risk assessments. They can provide expertise in identifying hazards, evaluating risks and recommending appropriate control measures. Also, the volunteers themselves, the people doing the tasks should be involved. Volunteers themselves play a crucial role in identifying the risks associated with their specific activities. They often are the first to notice any potential hazards based on their experiences. Encouraging open communication and feedback from volunteers can provide invaluable insights and contribute to a comprehensive risk assessment. People are far more likely to work safely and adhere to control measures if they are involved and understand why they have to do something rather than just being told that's the rules. So How do we create a risk assessment for volunteers? First of all, we need to understand the definitions of hazard and risk. So a hazard is anything with the potential to cause harm. The risk is the chance, the likelihood of that actually happening. So in one example of a hazard and risk for perhaps a volunteer carrying out a garden clearing job could be, the hazard could be sharp objects such as broken glass, metal scraps, thorny plants in the garden area. The risk, so the volunteer could sustain cuts, lacerations, puncture wounds, infection while clearing the area, and maybe require medical attention. So to mitigate this risk, volunteers should be provided with the proper personal protective equipment, such as cut or puncture resistant gloves and safety footwear, and they should be trained to just inspect the area for hazards before beginning work. So it can be just as simple as that will avoid these potential injuries. So the risk assessment process. The actual process itself is quite simple, and the HSE, the Health and Safety Executive, recommend that we use the 5-step process. The Health and Safety Executive, just to explain quickly, are the people that enforce health and safety in this country. So step 1, identifying hazards. So you need to look at things like your activities, the locations of activities, the equipment being used, any substances, so products, cleaning products, chemicals. So there could be some safety hazards, including things like slips, trips and falls, vehicle movement if they were working in a car park area, tool and machinery. There could be some health hazards, manual handling, noise, biological agents. We'll talk about those in a bit more detail later. Decide who might be harmed and how. Now, the group could be just volunteers, but it might be other people as well that are around in the area. It could be the public, it could be other contractors, there could be other people, and we do need to consider this as well. Step 3 is evaluating the risk, where we look at what the current risk level is that we've already got controls in place with. And is it acceptable? Is more action needed? Do we need to do more to reduce it? We'll look at a risk matrix a bit later on. Step 4 is about recording the significant findings of your assessment. The legal requirement is to maintain written records if there are 5 or more people employed. But even if less, I would always advise that they are written, because you still have a legal requirement to carry out the risk assessment regardless. So how would you evidence that you've done it if you haven't got it written down? And then the step 5 is to review the risk assessment regularly, because there can always be changes. It could be changes in staffing levels, the method of the activity or task that you're expecting the volunteers to do. Technology could have changed. You might use different tools, equipment. These things can affect the risk levels. Legally, reviews are required when there are reasons to believe that the current assessment is no longer valid. So typically, such as passage of time, any significant change, or after perhaps a near miss or accident. They can be done more often for higher risks, and it could be done less frequently for lower risks, but also monitoring the effectiveness of control measures should always just be an ongoing process. So what are hazards and how to identify the hazards? So to give you an idea of what the hazards are and what to look for, these are 6 main categories of hazard that could be considered when looking at risk assessments. So safety. These are hazards that create unsafe working conditions. So, for example, exposed wires, damaged carpet, where it might result in a tripping hazard. These are sometimes included under the category of physical hazards as well. But if, say, for example, you had someone decorating a village hall, these would be the sorts of hazards you might look for. So anything where it's got the potential to cause harm to somebody. Physical hazards can be environmental hazards and factors that can harm an employee without necessarily touching them. So things like perhaps working at height, noise, extreme heat and cold temperatures if working outside. So perhaps, when stewarding at an event, could be an incredibly hot day, or it could be, the other extreme where it's freezing cold, might be ice and snow on the ground. Chemical hazards. So chemical hazards are hazardous substances that could cause harm. These can result in both health and physical impacts, such as skin irritation, respiratory issues, blindness, corrosion. If they're mixed or left in the wrong conditions, can cause explosions. So even something simple as a cleaning task, so perhaps someone cleaning toilets, one cleaner could come along and perhaps use bleach to clean the toilet, and then a second cleaner, if they've not been given any guidance or any instruction, maybe using a toilet descaler. When those two substances could be mixed, they can cause toxic gas. So it's thinking about who does what, planning, and what you're using. Also, does the task include ergonomic hazards? So these are a result of physical factors that can result in musculoskeletal injuries, so aches and pains, back injuries, muscle strains. So for example, a poor workstation setup, maybe if someone's doing a bit of office work, poor posture in manual handling can give like work-related upper limb disorders or a back pain. So say perhaps someone litter picking or moving furniture or doing computer work is thinking about how that task is carried out and what you can do to basically simply reduce the risk to people. Biological hazards can include things like viruses, bacteria, insects, animals that can cause adverse health impacts. So for example, mold in a building, blood or other bodily fluids if someone's doing perhaps some caring tasks, harmful plants, sewage, dust, vermin. So it's just, again, looking at those things as part of the risk assessment. Also, something else that doesn't always get considered and might need to be thought about, psychosocial hazards. These include those that have an adverse effect on volunteers' mental health or well-being. So, for example, could be sexual harassment, could be victimisation, stress or workplace violence. So, for example, say someone working in a charity shop might be exposed to maybe an aggressive customer. Could be verbally aggressive, might be physically violent. Again, hopefully these incidents are rare, but it is something that needs to be considered, and how would that be managed or controlled to stop it either happening in the first place, or should the worst happen, what then needs to be done? We have a retained advisory service where we work with customers, and I've worked with a large organisation that used volunteers as part of for part of an event. It was a large public open air event. And basically, it's interesting. Employees were given a lot of information, briefing, training, PPE, understood the process, or the risk assessments. But at that time, it hadn't been considered about what the volunteers do. And some of them are doing similar tasks to the employees. In 1 year, before we started working with them, they had a lot of small, sort of minor incidents. A lot of volunteers might have slipped and tripped, were involved with aggressive members of the public. And they couldn't understand at the time, they hadn't collated that information, and they couldn't understand why they didn't get a lot of take up the next year for volunteer work. We went in and we had a look at some of their information and some of the incidents, and realised that they weren't, that, you know, some of the volunteers were turning up and they hadn't necessarily been properly briefed, prepared, or made aware of the hazards and risks. So we worked with them to do a simple induction for volunteers, making sure they understood what the expectations were, what to do in the event of an emergency, how to dress, how to deal with people that might be upset, lost children, things like that. We also then got them to be involved with the risk assessments, and then they understood what was expected of them, the equipment that they should have received, what they should have, who to go to if there was an issue. Straight away, having that communication and involving the volunteers made them feel more valued, and we could see the value of their input. And then there was an uptake, and the next year there was much less, there were far fewer incidents, because people knew what they were doing. They felt confident in what they were doing because they were aware of the hazards and risks. So it just shows that it can improve and make things a more positive experience. So then going on to stage 2, with a risk assessment, who might be harmed and how. So employers' liability insurance covers direct employees, but it also includes volunteers, also agency workers, labour-only contractors, trainees. Public liability insurance covers everyone else from customers, visitors, and the general public, also neighbours, depending on the type of organisation, perhaps if they have service users. So next, consider who might be more vulnerable and why. You need to be clear about who might be harmed. You don't need to list everybody by name, but you do need to identify the groups. So you don't necessarily, if you've got employees, say, doing similar work to volunteers, and the controls are the same, the hazards are the same, you don't need to necessarily do a separate risk assessment, so long as the group of volunteers is identified on that risk assessment and they have access to that risk assessment. That would also be absolutely fine. It may be that it's just volunteers doing the work, so then the only group on there and the only group that might be affected would be listed as volunteers. So therefore, you don't always need the separate risk assessment. Some volunteers also you might need to consider might have particular requirements, such as new volunteers, young volunteers, new and expectant mothers might be volunteering, or people with disabilities or of additional support needs. So how could a volunteer be harmed? So a slip or trip might lead to bruising or perhaps a fracture, or being struck by something which could cause fracture or concussion, or a fall could cause anything from a bruise up to a major trauma, or potentially if it was a fall from height, maybe even death. Poor posture can result in sprains and strains. Musculoskeletal injuries, repetitive movements can result in soft tissue damage, such as strain injuries, and then more long-term health effects, such as cancers, can be caused by inhalations of, say, something like wood dust, if someone was doing a lot of wood working without any proper precautions. Or exposure to chemicals can result in minor skin irritations up to serious burns or perhaps blindness. So it's thinking about who can be harmed and how, and what do you need to do, basically planning. I'll touch on this subject. So this is the risk control hierarchy. So it's a simple thing to think about before you start doing risk assessments and sort of launching in with all complicated control measures. First of all, once we identify the hazards, we need to evaluate these risks. But if we could eliminate the hazard completely, like, say, for example, avoiding work at height, so avoiding someone having to use a ladder to do some cleaning, could that person perhaps use an extendable pole and do it from ground level? Straight away, you've removed the risk of falling from height. If you can't eliminate the hazard, could you use a safe alternative, like a less harmful chemical? We then have engineering controls. So implement changes to reduce the risk at source. So, for example, manual handling. Could you use trolleys or to move heavy loads rather than a person physically lifting it? Or installing maybe guards or machinery. Administrative controls. So could it be things like safe practices are needed, plenty of warning signs, instruction signs, and training to manage the risks. And then as a last resort, personal protective equipment, that's PPE. This is the last line of defence, including items like safety glasses, hard hats, hearing protection, gloves. It protects the individuals, but it doesn't eliminate the hazards. So you should always look at whether you could eliminate the hazards beforehand. So when we talk about this, always consider the higher control levels first before relying on PPE. But if they are provided, they must fit the individual properly and be compatible with other items being worn. Then to evaluate the risk, so we look at a matrix, which is severity times likelihood. So if you were to assess the current risk, be honest about how well you manage the risks. Some organisations will be doing inspections and audits. You may well not be, but even a simple visual check, talking to people, look at what you've got in place. Do you need to change your control measures? Sometimes, depending on the task that's doing, if it's a little bit more complex, you need to look at guidance within your industry. Evaluate the risk. This means deciding if your current control measures are at an acceptable level. You can compare your control measures to industry guidelines if that's in that area. Using a risk matrix if you look at the risk matrix, it can basically just give you a simple colour coding of sort of low, medium and high, so that people can understand what the residual risk is left. When deciding on additional control measures, think about legal obligations and good practice. Aim to reduce risks as low as reasonably practical, but by balancing the risk against time, trouble and money needed to control it. So for example, spending many thousands to prevent minor injuries is excessive and wouldn't be expected. But spending the same amount to avoid, say, for example, a fire that could kill many people would be justified. So what's practical for one risk may not be for another. So again, you know, if, say, someone was asked to be moving furniture or boxes, doing some manual handling, there's a potential for a back injury. You have no history of incidents. Training's been given, sack trucks, trolleys, and maybe it might be a team lifting assistance given and occasional work. So the severity could be major because someone could seriously hurt their back and might be out of action for several weeks. But the likelihood would be remote, giving you a score of medium. So you would look at, if you look at the matrix, you can actually see, so looking at major is 3. We've decided that the likelihood's remote because you've got a lot of control measures in place. So your score would then come out at 9, sort of in a yellow area, which would be potentially medium. Again, you don't have to use a matrix. You can use different types of matrices to fit your organisation, but that just gives you a simple scoring method so that you can prioritise your highest risks and see what you need to do more. With regards to recording the significant findings, it's really important. It's a legal requirement, but it's a critical step in ensuring their safety and understanding the potential hazards. Once a risk assessment is conducted, it's essential that the documents and findings are clear and comprehensive. Effective communication of findings to volunteers involves sharing the information through an accessible and engaging manner. This can be achieved through training sessions, informational handouts, safety briefings, digital platforms. Depends what fits your organisation. When talking about training, not all training needs to be a full-on formal course. It very much depends on the activity, the risk level, the equipment, the experience of people. So for example, if someone was using, say, a short set of steps to access high storage on an occasional basis, a suitable comprehensive briefing on how to use the equipment safely, what to look for, along with the risk assessment and the control measures, might be acceptable. And also, once the person's read it and understood it, get it signed and completed. However, if it was, say, using a scissor lift because it was something that was a much longer task, required different equipment, a formal qualification such as an IPAF 3A that was in date would be expected. So it very much depends on the activity that you're asking the person to do as to what the level of training needs to be. By ensuring that volunteers are well trained and well informed about the hazards and risks and the safety controls in place, we can empower them to form their roles confidently and safely, fostering a culture of awareness and proactive risk management within the organisation, which will lower the risk of any claims or any injuries. So key considerations for your volunteers. So basically as simple as plan and prepare. So rather than, you know, just sending off someone to do an activity without it being looked at, consider hazards and risks, what equipment, what PPE someone might need, some simple planning, going through those 5 steps. Match the task to the individual. It's no good asking someone to use a step ladder if they really don't like heights, you know, or they are scared of heights. You are there straight away increasing the risk, and it's something that someone shouldn't be asked to do. What tools and equipment have you got? Provide information, instruction and training. So within When conducting a risk assessment, it's vital to plan and prepare thoroughly. Start by defining the task, match it to the right individual, ensure the right tools and equipment are available, provide comprehensive information, instruction and training to everyone involved so they understand the risks and how to manage them effectively. This approach helps minimise hazards and ensures that each person is well equipped to carry out the task safely. Other things you may need to consider depending on what the person's doing. So when doing risk assessments for volunteers, it's important to think about a few key things as well. So where appropriate, make sure that and carry out DBS, the sort of disclosure and barring service checks are carried out and in good time before whether the volunteer carries out the activity. Making sure that also you have proper safeguarding measures and policies in place, again, depending on your organisation and the size and what you're doing. You should also check your insurance, that it covers both volunteers and the organisation in case something goes wrong. Plus also don't forget about data protection. So any personal information that you keep and gather needs to be kept safe and securely and confidential according to the rules. By keeping these points in mind, you can help and create a safe and secure environment for everyone involved. So embedding effective risk assessments for your volunteers. Here are some simple practical tips just to get it right. So when conducting risk assessments, it's crucial to engage your volunteers and stakeholders all involved in the task to gather diverse perspectives, experience and insights. Document your findings using a suitable and clear assessment template, which we'll look at in a minute, ensuring that language is clear and concise for better understanding. Share the assessment and its findings with all relevant parties to promote. Implement the identified control measures and monitor their effectiveness over time. Once training related to the assessment is complete, I would advise obtaining a sign-off to confirm that understanding and compliance. Make sure that your assessments are easily accessible, whether in hard copy or on other digital platforms, and establish a routine for regularly reviewing and updating the assessments to reflect any changes in the risks or procedures. So I've got a couple of risk assessment example templates here, and this might help you sort of to get it clear in your mind and to make sure that you cover the right points. So we've got an HSE risk assessment template, which I will show you now. So basically, I hope you can see this template. It follows the 5-step process by using those headings that we've talked through. So what are the hazards? Who could be harmed and how? When you are ready, what you are already doing is putting examples of good practice in place. So housekeeping, training, PPE, guards. Do you need to do anything else to control the risk? You may or may not do. You may have some good controls in place and don't need to do anything further. If you do need to take any additional action, then you should document who and what it is that needs to be done and sign it off when it has been complete. This is very important from a claims defensibility standpoint, because if the risk assessment has identified that additional actions were required and these have not been followed and closed out, it would be difficult to demonstrate that the organisation had done everything suitably and sufficiently to reduce the risk. You don't have to have a section 4 categorising the risk, but I do think it can be useful, because even a simple high, medium and low, it will help show people clearly what the risk has been designated as, and also it helps you in your organisation prioritise if there were at higher risk and what else you might need to do. It is important that all risk assessments are available to anyone that needs to see them, and obviously the information needs to be clear and understandable from an insurer's point of view, so that we can use that if we needed to in the event of a claim from a claims defensibility point of view. The second example, again, it's just to show you some It's an incomplete one, but it's just to show you how to start a risk assessment, say for a litter picking activity. So it gives you an idea of some of this is not an exhaustive list, by the way, but it's it's a starting point. So the person, they might come into contact with members of the public. Is there any water, working near water or cliffs? Would the volunteer be lone working? What would they do in the event of an emergency or an accident? The headings are the same as the HSC, so if you follow that, you can't go far wrong. The hazards and been harmed and how, what control measures are in place, so what you've got, and then adding the severity and risk rating if you feel. There's many ways to record risk assessments, but always stick to a clear and simple template and a simple matrix. You can't go far wrong. Regular reviews and monitoring. The final step is to review your risk assessments to make sure it's relevant and kept up to date. People switch off if they've got something that's 5 years old and it's not relevant or it doesn't reflect what they're doing. So talk to the people doing the jobs. Look at any accidents and incident statistics if you have any. It's good practice to have a simple formal system in place for reporting any hazards or defects. So, for example, if someone was to notice defective flooring, if they reported it, you can get that done and it will prevent any slips and trips. Risk assessments should be reviewed when necessary. For some, this might be annually, or it might be more frequently for higher risk, or it might be less frequently for lower risk. If there's been an accident or a near miss, that would prompt a review, or any, say, changes, maybe a new building layout or a new building. Those are the sorts of things you need to think about. And there's little point in recommending any further control measures if they're not implemented, and they should be signed off. The key takeaways, I think, for successful volunteer risk assessments, always adhere to a systematic approach, recommended as the 5 steps. Involve others where necessary, especially if it's complex or unusual. You might need to seek more competent expertise in a specific area to validate a risk assessment. There are lots of places that you can seek further advice, and it might be something or if it was something to do with a piece of equipment, you might be able to talk to a supplier, a manufacturer. So always know your level of where your knowledge ends and starts, and make sure that you get competent advice should you need further advice. Focus on significant findings. Avoid getting bogged down with minor details. The law does not require documenting every single minor risk. The purpose of risk assessment is to identify significant risks that can be controlled and managed and reduced where possible. Utilise the hierarchy of controls. Sometimes swapping a corrosive cleaning product for a non-hazardous, environmentally friendly one, therefore you've eliminated the hazard. It can be as simple as that. Be practical and proportional. Conducting a risk assessment does not need to be overly complex. Verify that your controls align with best practice. Effectively communicate it, and ensure that significant findings that people understand their responsibilities. It's advisable to have the individuals sign off to confirm that they've reviewed and understood the risk assessment, which helps from the claims defensibility point, as I've mentioned. Regularly review the assessment, especially after if there's any significant changes. Lastly, ensure that proper retention of documents to prevent electronic records from being overwritten, which is vital in supporting claims defensibility. By maintaining access to the risk assessment that was in place at the first time is critical, especially for any loss or injury. So that's a whistle-stop tour of basically how to do a risk assessment. Hopefully you understand that it can be quite a simple process, and it's about the planning, doing, checking, and then acting, really. We've got some additional resources here. So the NCVO have a fantastic website with lots of useful resources I recommend you have a look at. I've also added some other links which I think you might find useful. And I would like to thank you all very much for listening. I'll hand you back over to Nick for the Q&A session, and I hope that that's given you some useful tips and proved helpful. Many thanks.
That was awesome. Thank you so much, Dawn. And
Thank
you're
you.
getting like a huge kind of round of applause, kind of virtually, kind of
Oh,
on
thank
screen. You
you.
can see those kind of going up now. But
Thank
yeah,
you.
that was kind of so thorough. Like that's loads of information to kind of absorb in kind of 35, kind of 40 minutes.
Sorry, yes.
But it was a great kind of introduction. And obviously, there's lots of kind of signposting on screen now. And before we kind of head off at 11 o'clock, I'll signpost you to other areas of the NCVO kind of website and externally that can kind of offer you more kind of insight and information. Now, if you do have any kind of questions that you want to put to Dawn, do pop them into the Q&A function at the bottom of the screen. They will get lost if you put them into the chat, so do make sure that you've added them into the Q&A function. But before we move on to that kind of Q&A, I just want to highlight that if you're not yet a member of NCVO, we would love to welcome you into our community of 17,000 organisations, from the biggest household name charities to the smallest community groups. Now, 70% of our members have free membership and 90% of our members are small with a turnover of under £1 million a year. So do take a look at our many member benefits, from the 30% off a place at our hugely popular training courses to the huge number of downloadable tools and templates that are held behind the member paywall that will help save you time and money so that you can focus on the things that really matter. If you've got any questions about NCVO membership, do reach out to our membership team by emailing them at membership@ncvo.org.uk. But now we've got 20 minutes before we can head off, Dawn. So let's kind of jump into the Q&As. And there's a number of kind of key questions that kind of come through on the Q&A board as well. But to kind of kick us off, what steps should be taken to review and improve the risk assessment after an incident occurs that may have involved a volunteer? What would you recommend?
It would be advisable to, so hopefully the incident would have had some sort of investigation. So it doesn't need to, and again, using the word investigations, people think, oh, you know, it needs to be a huge bureaucratic sort of nightmare. It can actually just be as simple as finding out, looking at the accident form, finding out what happened, understanding why it happened, and looking at how it can be prevented. So again, I would always go to, there should be an incident form and there should be some sort of investigation. And whether that is, you know, obviously depending on the level of injury, it might be something, if it's something quite simple, it can just be a brief chat and understanding how it happened. Obviously, if it's something far more complex, then there might be other people needing to be involved. But basically having a look at that information, talking to the person and understanding why it happened. And then now it may be that something went wrong, maybe a control measure wasn't followed. So it might be that no changes need to be made except for perhaps a little bit further training to make sure that, or a little bit further supervision, or it could be that maybe a control measure wasn't adequate enough. So basically I would talk to the people involved, look at the information you've been provided with, look at your risk assessment, and also going along and observe the task. Sometimes you can see things that perhaps when you're just talking to people you wouldn't necessarily see. Have a look and then see if you can improve it from there. Just keep it quite simple, really. But I think it's about effective communication, observation, and just making sure that your paperwork matches what people are actually doing.
That's great. And then I suppose we can link to that. Like, how do we, you spoke lots about kind of empowering kind of volunteers to be able to kind of spot those kind of risks themselves and manage them. But how do we kind of meaningfully engage them in the risk assessment kind of process?
I think one ways we've done it in the past is, I mean, we would, when someone's doing a task or a task is being planned, involve them in the process. So it's not about just telling people what to do, but asking, because people have a lot of different experiences, you know, expertise, things that sometimes the risk assessor may not always have as well. So by talking to people rather than just telling them what to do and getting them involved, and observation of the task as well, can actually be quite meaningful. That's, I think, again, it's about working together rather than just handing people bits of paper and saying, this is your risk assessment, this is what you do. You know, get involved where you can. Again, it can, depending on the level of risk and the actual complexity of the task involved. You know, if it's quite a simple task, it can be, you know, it can be a short thing, but I mean, it can be longer for something a little bit more complex. But I think for me, it's about nurturing that relationship with volunteers, and bringing them in and getting them on the journey so they understand why we're doing this, rather than people just being handed a piece of paper and then thinking that, and then it just turns people off. So that's the way that we would approach it.
And thinking of them handing a piece of paper, that can just become kind of quite mundane. You kind of gloss over it.
It can. I mean,
But,
and I think, again, things we've used in the past is, again, obviously it does depend on your type of organisation, but sometimes it can be quick team briefings, one-to-one briefings. It could be, sometimes the key points could be put into a part of a newsletter, top tips for that month. If you have an intranet, the information can go on there. So there can be a whole variety of ways. Some places don't have the digital platforms, so they'll just have a little handbook with them in, but with using simple language and sometimes some sort of colourful images to sort of just draw people in and just make it more interesting, rather than just reams and reams of bits of paper. So.
That's great. And then what would you recommend in terms of, the importance of kind of documenting the things that you do kind of put in place? How regularly would you anticipate like a volunteer should kind of sign something to make sure that they understand what the risks
Yeah,
are
I
and how
mean,
they can be managed?
I think generally, I mean, there is no hard and fast with regards to legal requirement as to reviewing. As I've said, it's when there's any changes. I think particularly when sort of volunteers first start, it's really important that they're made aware of what these documents are and what's involved. So normally perhaps at induction, when people are being given the information, that's a good time. And then generally, if you're reviewing your risk assessments annually, it's probably a good time to do that. It doesn't necessarily need, if nothing has changed, your volunteer hasn't changed, the task hasn't changed, you could extend the period, and it's quite a low risk activity. It's very much depends on the risk and the complexity of what someone's doing. But if it's very simple, and again, if you're updating your documentation regularly, which is advisable, particularly from a claims point of view, if you produce something that someone might have looked at 5 years ago, would they necessarily still remember that they signed it 5 years ago? You don't need to make it a huge onerous task, but I do think it's good to have a system in place to, even if, say, signing your risk assessment perhaps every couple of years, if it's just low risk and you've reviewed them, they're all up to date, they're refreshed, send them out and just remind people.
Perfect. And then I know like today was all about kind of risk assessments and kind of building the risk assessments yourself, and you're not necessarily here to kind of advise on kind of safeguarding or data protection, but would you expect to see kind of things around kind of data security and safeguarding embedded in a risk assessment itself?
Yeah, you wouldn't need a separate risk assessment. You would include those things. You could include those things within it, because again, there's a potential hazard and risk. So there could be, a data breach, or particularly a safeguarding risk, say if it was something to do with a caring activity or looking after children and things. So yes, you could include that in there, and it can literally be simple as bullet points, your control measures of what it is you're doing, or if you're not doing enough, what else you need to do in your additional actions. And so long as it's documented, but it's actually what you're doing. I have seen in the past with customers that sometimes we work with, they put down what people think they want to see, but it's not. When you look in practice and something's happened, it's not actually what's happening. And it's about having something that is what you're doing and trying to improve on it, really, because at the end of the day, all this is about is making sure that people go home in the same condition that they turned up in. We want to keep people safe.
Definitely. And then for kind of lots of charities, community kind of organisations, they might be responsible for kind of delivering events. And I suppose that those events, they might be bringing in kind of like external providers, or they might be using an event space. And so to what extent do you rely upon the risk assessments that are produced by those external providers, or those kind of guests that you're bringing in, or those external spaces? And do you combine them with your own, or do you keep them separate?
You can, and again, I would generally, very depends on the type of event. Generally, they would be kept separate, because the person being brought in to do something is responsible in doing for doing it the way that they've put in that risk assessment. However, the organisation that is bringing that person in needs to be comfortable that that risk assessment is suitable and sufficient. That when you're doing events, and again, it does very much depend on what, where, and the size of it, but usually there should be some sort of event plan. So who's in charge, what to do in the event of an emergency, what contractors or other people you might be bringing in, those sorts of things. So your risk assessments would be part of the bigger project. But again, yes, you would generally keep them separate, but you would have a responsibility to ensure that they are fit for the external risk assessments are fit for purpose and work with what you need within your event. We can offer other advice specifically on event planning, and that's a whole nother sort of subject. But yes, you could keep your risk assessments separately, but you would also need to communicate your risk assessments to the people coming in, as the contractors or the other people setting up as well. It's about communication. It's no good you just knowing your control measures if nobody else knows it. So it would be about cross-sharing information.
Excellent. And then I suppose over the past 3 or 4 years, since COVID, volunteering has changed quite dramatically.
Yeah.
And now lots of volunteers might carry out their volunteer roles from home. So they would be like remote volunteers, and then lots of volunteers would also be volunteering alone and remotely, like going into people's houses or meeting people one-to-one. To what extent should those activities also form part of the risk assessment? So volunteering remotely from your home, or volunteering alone?
Again, it's classed as lone working. So a risk assessment would be needed to carry out for those activities, and basically just working out what your control measures are for that. So whether or not that's making sure that the person in charge knows where that volunteer is, knows what the activities are for the day, roughly, what would happen in the event of emergency when that person is expected back. I'm talking about if, say, someone was going into someone's home. And again, it's about keeping it proportionate, just knowing so that should something happen, you know where that person is and what needs to be done. If you're working from home, again, it's no different to you having employees working at home. It's about having regular contact. If people are doing some work from home, if they've got an online calendar, keeping the calendar up to date so people know whilst they're working where they are and what they're doing. And would someone know where, even if it's as simple as would someone's partner, if they've got one, or a relative, know where they are if there were if there was an issue. So yeah, no, it's no different to whatever an employee might be doing. You would put the same control measures in for a volunteer and just keep it simple and effective, really.
Great. And then we've got a question here from someone who runs gardening activities where they're relying upon any members of the public showing up to take part in an event.
Oh, okay.
And so do we need to make sure that the public who can come along to help to volunteer, maybe just like on an ad hoc basis, do we need to make sure that they accept and read a risk assessment before we allow them to do anything if they're not volunteering on a more formal, regular basis?
Ooh, the thing is, we still have a duty of care. And again, it depends. Yes, in effect, because although they are, yeah, that's an interesting one. Although they're still being expected to do a task, depending on obviously what it is and what the hazards and risks are. But again, it would be like, it's no different to sending in a regular volunteer into a task that they don't know what they're doing. They don't know what to do in the event of an emergency. They may not understand what they have to do. So it would be advisable, or at least some sort of briefing. And even if it was you could have a separate sheet that people could at least just briefly read and then sign if it's something low risk, because I can't imagine that you would have, well, I would hope that you're not having something people turn up and participating in high risk activities. So I think it's just about, again, clear instruction and information sharing, just making sure, even if that's a verbal briefing and they've sort of understood what it is they can and can't do to cause harm to anybody else.
Lovely. And then the final question for you, Dawn, and it's kind of quick fire round of kind of questions that you've done brilliantly at so far. But finally, how often would you recommend that organisations review a risk assessment? And is there a minimum set of time kind of set by law or by the HSE that these should be reviewed?
No, so there's no set time. Good practice would be annually. It can be more often if it's high risk or there's been any significant changes, so that would be after the event. I mean, it really does depend on how the organisation works. Some companies we work with, they might have on a 2-yearly basis, but more often if something has happened, just for that perhaps one risk assessment. Some companies or some organisations like to do it on an annual basis because they review all their documentation annually. I think regular is the key word here, and a regular can mean a lot of different things. But I think to produce something that's sort of 5 years ago is too long. But sort of between 1 and 3 years, I think is a reasonable, sensible length of time, depending on the level of risk. If it was higher risk, probably a little bit more often, but between 1 and 3 would be ideal. But generally, most do it between annually and 2 yearly.
Perfect. Well, that's it. That kind of brings our kind of Q&A to a close, Dawn. Thank you so much. We've still got another kind of 14 questions that are open that we didn't have a chance to kind of cover, but Dawn very kindly said that she would be happy to take some of these kind of questions away and type out the answers, and we'll kind of make sure that we can send them round within the next kind of week or two to kind of cover off all the questions that we didn't have a chance to cover today. But Dawn, thank you for that. That's awesome. And then just a final kind of quick couple of things to kind of highlight some further resources and support for you. So if you don't already know, there's heaps of help and guidance on the NCVO website relating to managing risks involving volunteers, safeguarding volunteers, and finding the appropriate volunteer insurance. Plus, we've got a number of training courses that members receive a 30% discount for, including Volunteers in the Law and Good Practice in Volunteer Management. And not far away, on the 13th of March, we're hosting another free webinar in partnership with Zurich, looking at the essential steps related to safeguarding, which we would love to see you at. For any questions that you can't find the answers to online, NCVO also has a free helpline for small charities, so you can scan the QR code that's on the slide now to find the details of how to contact them. And contact details will also be shared in the follow-up email that will be sent shortly after today's webinar. And then for any DBS related queries, you can contact your DBS regional outreach advisor, who can answer DBS related queries, providing advice via phone or email. And they can help organisations and network to understand what levels of DBS checks can be applied for and what information these checks will provide. And of course, today's webinar has been delivered in partnership with our trusted supplier, Zurich Insurance, who provide insurance to charities, social enterprises and community groups of all shapes and sizes. They offer a fixed package for organisations with an income of under £300,000, where cover includes a £5 million public liability, including cover for volunteers. They offer personal accident cover and up to £10 million for employees' liability. The QR code that's on screen will take you to further information about Zurich and how Zurich can help and support your organisation. And again, further information will be provided in the follow-up email. So in our final minute together, any second now, a snap poll will appear on your screen to get your initial thoughts on how you found today's webinar. If you've got time as well, we also have a short feedback survey, which will appear on your browser as you leave the Zoom call, where you can give feedback on the things you've found helpful, what you'd like more information on, and most importantly, where we could make improvements. So I hope the past hour has been useful and you've got a list of the things that you want to do and the conversations that you need to have with your organisational staff, volunteers and trustees. But finally, a huge thanks to Dawn for guiding us through the last hour and for answering all of your questions. And thanks to all of you as well for joining this webinar this morning in partnership with Zurich. We're so pleased that you could join us, and hopefully we'll see you again on the 13th of March for our next webinar on the essentials of safeguarding.